Hello everybody, and welcome to this thrilling, exhilarating, and exciting edge-of-your-seat round glass review. Now it's time to find out whether or not I might have just oversold this a little. Today we're going to talk about the KamLan 50mm f1.1 version 1. I'm going to have sample photos and all the standard stuff we do in these videos. Now KamLan is the brand. According to the Kickstarter page, the company that makes these is Mroe Optics. This was first released on Amazon on the 24th of March in 2017. I could not verify whether or not it is still in production. At minimum, it is still available on the KamLan website new. Version 2 of this lens, which is a completely different optical design, was released on the 13th of September 2019 on Amazon. Typical lens uses for lenses like this, a 50mm APS-C ultra-fast, include fast aperture portraits. This being an APS-C lens, the effective focal length for those of us used to film or full frame is 75mm. That's on the short end of typical portrait focal lengths. So if you're new to this series, I'm not going to set this lens up to succeed or fail. I've got video and photo that will mimic how I think you're going to actually use it in the real world. To get to the crux of this right now, this lens is excellent for portraits with some asterisks. It can do general photography, and it can do that well, but this is really a lens that does its best when you isolate your subjects, such as with a portrait or a closely cropped still life. Old news to anyone who's read the product page for this lens, the focal length and AOV are 50mm and 31 degrees respectively, and that is for APS-C. This lens does not cover a full frame image sensor, so if you decide to use it on full frame, you will get a little bit more image circle, but it's not really usable image circle. The aperture range is 1.1 to 16. It is fully stepless. Filter size is 52mm. Closest focus is 0.5 meters, which is 1.64 feet, or in the American tradition of using any system of measurement which is not metric, that is 1e plus 8 beard seconds. It is manual focus only, and was available, and still is, for if you bought it new on KamLan's website, in Sony E, Fuji X, Canon EOS M, and Micro Four Thirds. I used this exclusively in Sony E mount. The weight is 248 grams. Now, an added note here, if you check out the KamLan website for this lens, if you look at the product page, there's a photo near the bottom of it of a hiker standing on top of a mountain summit. This lens has 12 aperture blades. If you look at that photo of the hiker, there's the sun is in that photo. The sun is projecting 18 points in the aperture-induced star. Odd-numbered irises double the number of points in their stars. Even-numbered irises have the same number of points in their stars. My star point test shots for this lens showed 12-pointed stars. Make of that what you will, and decide for yourself whether or not you trust the sample photos on the KamLan webpage for this lens to have been taken with one of them. Here's my best tip. This lens is excellent for center-framed portraits. It can do some general photography and well, but this lens is really designed to isolate subjects. Also, we know that this lens is designed for wider aperture use because of the way that the aperture ring closes. So the physical rotational distance on the ring from f16 to f5.6, which is, 3 stops, is approximately the exact same rotational distance as f5.6 to f2.8, which is 2 stops. Also, from f2.8 to f2, which is 1 stop, and from f2 to approximately f1.4, again, 1 stop. So what that means is that this lens gives photographers much more fine aperture control at the wider aperture settings than it does at the smaller. That's going to give you much more precise aperture use, wide open, and indicates that that's really where this lens is meant to be used, from f1.1 to about f5.6. Coincidentally, that's also where it performs the best. For subjects, I would say you should not photograph with this lens. Architecture absolutely tops that list, and that's due to this lens's poor corner-to-corner sharpness, fairly significant barrel distortion, and field curvature. Close behind that astrophotography, and that's solely due to this lens having soft perimeters, especially at the fast apertures. You could do some star trails or astrophotography if you wanted, but the results will not be as good as they are with other fast 50mm lenses in the f1.1 aperture versus, say, a very well-corrected f1.4 50mm lens. Doesn't buy you nearly as much extra light as it seems like it should. This lens is pretty metering mode agnostic, so shoot away with whatever metering mode you're using for your subject or scene. You will, however, need to shoot this lens in aperture priority. That is typical, by the way, with all of the lenses of this production type and cost point. Also, keep the lens hood on this lens and keep bright lights out of the scene. This lens creates halo rainbow flares, and there's some samples here. They're not good photos, but they show what it does. And those rainbow halos emanate directly from point light when it's in your frame. This will also create green, and I think in a couple of places I saw some blue ghosting, and also some general flare if you have a bright light like the sun outside of your frame. In fact, the lens hood on this lens is pretty short. So if you find that you're using the lens hood and still getting issues with flaring, you could buy a telephoto lens hood in the 52mm thread and be just fine. It would not show up in your images on APS-C. This lens can mount on full-frame cameras, but there is significant vignetting as these sample shots illustrate. So if you wanted to, say, shoot square format images, using a full-frame camera could buy you some added image circle use. Now, huge asterisk if you want to do that. The quality of the image circle outside of the APS-C framing area is not good. This lens looks like a sonar-derived design, and I'm sticking by my gut that I'm right on that. However, there's this odd flat element in the middle, right in front of the aperture. And if it's truly flat on both sides, then it should serve no purpose. But it must, or it wouldn't be there. So for me, this is a really interesting design because it's a 50mm lens with a register distance of approximately 18mm, where the actual element sits in relationship to the register is a little bit hard to gauge, but that rear element is somewhere in the 15 to 20mm range from the sensor. And so this looks like a sonar, and it functions like a telephoto, which is strange. And I love this design. I really just wish that I loved the images it delivered as much. For breathing, noting that this test is fairly extreme as always, at f1.1 the foreground robot disappears entirely as focus reaches just about 2 meters away from the closest focus of a ½ meter. Setting the aperture to f5.6 reveals that at the smaller apertures, breathing is more well controlled than the wider apertures make it appear, and that owes just to the circle of confusion size in out of focus areas. For video use, this could translate to a tolerable breathing amount when transitioning between closely placed subjects. So for instance, if you had two people next to each other and you were filming from the side or one in front of the other separated by a few feet, you could theoretically focus from one person's face to the other without the breathing being intolerable, but you will want to test that functionality and results before you record for real. As noted, the aperture is stepless and has 12 aperture blades, and they are mostly rounded until you get down to one of the smaller apertures. So in terms of focusing and using aperture control in video with this lens, it's really well designed for that. The front element is non-rotating, but it does move in and out about 1 centimeter when it's focused from infinity to a ½ meter. Focus throw on this lens is approximately 180 degrees, which is good for a fast manual focus lens. The focus ring itself is stationary. Focus ring damping is suitable. It's a bit easier to rotate the focus ring on this lens than many of the other comparably priced brand new lenses that I've used. The focus ring on mine has no play, and it, by the way, has been pretty well abused. So it has no play, but it does make a clicking sound proportional to the focus force used when it reaches the hard stop at either end of the focus throw. So just note that for video use, if you're going to be focusing from one end to the other or into an area that is near one of the extreme focus points, you'll ideally want to set your end focus point before the actual hard stop or risk getting a click in your video's audio if you're recording on the camera. Sharpness is suitable in the center for portraits at most apertures. Wide open, it's a bit soft. Stop down from anything really that's smaller than f8, bit soft. I used this lens across apertures and I found that it was sharpest when it's focused close, which is to say within 5 or 6 feet of the front of the lens, and then from around f2.8 to f5.6. That's really where this lens performs the best, and that also aligns with this lens primarily being a portrait lens. Build quality is very good with all metal construction insofar as I can tell. Asterisk, I didn't dismantle this lens to verify that it is in fact all metal inside, but it's heavy enough that it feels like it is. Focus and aperture ring movement are in control, are good. They aren't loose, they aren't too hard to move. They are really very well designed in that regard. Contrast is generally flat with this lens, which I personally prefer because that allows for more contrast control in post without losing the ability to edit for flatness. Now just remember, you can always add contrast. It's very hard, if not impossible, to remove it. The aperture shape is listed on the KamLan webpage as rounded, and to that end, the aperture will throw light stars before the blurry areas in the unfocused light points in the blurry areas take on a dodecahedron shape. So in general, yes, the aperture does maintain a fairly circular nature through most of the range. The out of focus area characteristics are okay. That means that if you have a solid color foreground or background, out of focus area is going to work. With foregrounds or backgrounds like grass, rocks, trees, and things like that which have texture and overlapping elements, this lens's field curvature and the hint of coma that it has become fairly apparent, and the blurry areas can interfere with your overall image quality and presentation. So, as a sidebar, this is more of an issue as the lens stops down. And by stopping down, I mean being smaller than f5.6. Wide open from f1.1 to around about f2, this lens's out of focus areas are soft enough that it doesn't really matter what kind of overlap or texture you have in your foreground or background. The out of focus area is pretty much going to be pleasing no matter what is in those areas. Design flaws have pretty well been covered already in this video, but the optical design does introduce some issues that are worth being mindful of when you shoot. The point of that is just be sure to test this lens out as you plan to use it before you use it for real. Balance with cameras is generally good. It feels at home on heavier cameras like the A6400 and only slightly front heavy on light cameras like the A5000 and Nex 3. The KamLan 50mm f1.1 version 1 suffers from some significant optical flaws that limit its use as a general lens, which most people consider 50mm focal length lenses to be. The flaws in this lens do, however, give the lens's images a decidedly character-rich appearance that you will either love or not love. I really see no room for middle ground with this lens. For me, I love it with portraits, and I find that with dogs, which are my most common portrait subject, it does really work stunningly well. And I could see it working well for bokeh-style photos of objects and potentially even some still life settings. But beyond that, this is not a lens I find myself reaching for often. 50mm is a strange focal length to me on APS-C cameras. It's a bit too narrow to tackle most general shooting, and a bit too wide for the majority of APS-C portrait work. The fast aperture on this lens compensates for that latter point somewhat, and ultimately, what makes this lens one that I reach for rarely is exactly the point above. On APS-C cameras, this lens's focal length is simply a challenge to use for most subjects. So this is not a lens for everyone. It's not a lens you're going to carry around on your camera 24/7 for the rest of your life or every time you go out with it. And the look that this lens yields will not suit every aesthetic. If this looks like a lens that you will like, then for the cost, it's a good option. In terms of budget, portrait-oriented lenses, this is a hard one to beat. You just need to accept some of the trade-offs with what you're going to have to do for your image framing and some of the compromises or elements you're going to have to accept in your image's look.